Hi, my name is Tyler Russo. Rome is burning. I haven't been outside in 12 days. We are in the midst of a global catastrophe unprecedented within my lifetime. It's currently 10:55 p.m. on a Sunday, and it's time to paint an Ork Meka dread. When my orcs are eventually buried with me, like the terracotta soldiers of Qin Shi Huang, I assume most of them would still be unfinished by the time of my death. And like the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, all commission painters I've hired to work on the project will be buried alive beside me. That is still the case, but maybe now we won't have to bury as many. How to paint an Ork Meka dread while society collapses around you. Step 1. Accidentally buy the loudest air compressor in the entire world and paint exclusively between the hours of 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. Step 2. Live in a crowded apartment complex in a major urban area with walls the thickness of construction paper. Step 3. Don't know your neighbors very well, so you have the cognitive dissonance to not feel too bad or think about the consequences of your actions very much. All of this loud noise and lack of empathy will put you in the emotional mindset you need to be in to paint like a true orc. Step 4. Undercoat and base the entire model without pressing the record button. Step 5. Get distracted fighting a stranger on Facebook, defending the merits of Scarboys, and completely forget that you were making a video. Let at least 30 to 45 minutes pass by to thoroughly marinate your conscience with the guilt of wasted time. Step 6. Time to actually paint a Ork Meka dread. So I didn't record this part, but this first stage is pretty simple. I primed the model with black spray primer, then airbrushed it with an extremely watered down coat of Scrag Brown, followed by an extremely watered down coat of Troll Slayer Orange. I'll mention specific paint colors if people want to follow along, but any comparable color is fine. I covered the entirety of the base's surface with a grill and Badland, and after letting that dry, I put some Martian Iron Earth on top for detail. Again, you can use whatever you want though. There's a lot of comparable alternatives out there. These are just the ones that I had. Sanded Tile Gout and Crackle Paste Medium are good alternatives, just to name a couple. So the purpose of the dark brown is to serve as an undercoat for when we do chipping later on. After it dries, I applied a coat of matte varnish to the entirety of the model. So to do most of the chipping, I use this stuff called Chipping Medium by Vallejo. Basically what it does is peel any paint that you put on top of the enamel layer away if you apply water and pressure to the surface of the model. The matte varnish prevents our base coat layer, the dark brown, from chipping. If you don't matte varnish the undercoat, it tends to peel off a little bit when we do chipping later on. The chipping medium will look glossy and wet, but you don't actually need to wait that long before moving on to painting on top of it. Waiting for the matte varnish to dry is a lot more important. I use spray matte varnish for this model because he's really fucking big, but matte varnishing by hand works just as well. If you do use spray matte varnish and you get like a dusting effect, it's probably because you put too much on or because you didn't shake the can well enough. You can get rid of that by doing another coat after it dries, and it'll reactivate the layer that you have underneath and remove most of the dusting. The key is just to be really light with it. I used to fuck up models all the time by putting too much matte varnish on, and the frosting effect that happens is super frustrating, but it can be removed counterintuitively with more matte varnish. Just absolutely make sure the second coat is really light and wait at least 24 hours before applying it. After you're done figuring out why your airbrush is broken, it's time to put on the color that you want most of your model to actually be. I'm using Hydra Turquoise by Army Painter with a little bit of Vallejo Flow Improver. I tend to feel like less saturated colors look a lot better on heavily weathered models, but I want this guy to have a distinctly Death Skulls or color palette. I'm also going to be mixing a lot of off-white with the same color later on. That'll desaturate it. The process of weathering in itself also tends to desaturate color. If you're adding dust effects, mixing in whatever your base color is with brown later, enamel weathering will desaturate the overall look. If you do want your model to look very saturated, bear that in mind too. After that was dry, I mixed in some Skeleton Bone by Army Painter with my base color and went back over most of the model again. You want to generate what's called ambient occlusion, which is a CG lighting term. Basically, only paint the areas where you feel like more light would be falling on the model if they were in actual sunlight, or any points of interest you want to call attention to. So for instance, I'm going to make his face super bright, the shoulder pads, and anything that feels like it would have less shadow on it if this model was actually outside. I'm going to keep mixing more and more bone color with my base color and reapply several highlight layers, each time getting a little more narrow, until you have really nice gradient transitions going on all throughout the model, where there's bright areas that fade into dark areas and become bright again, and making the brightest parts of the model the ones that you want the most attention drawn to, which generally on most models are going to be the upper body and face. Here's what the model looked like after a first pass of the technique I just described. And here he is after a second pass, doing the same thing, but being more discerning about where I put my highlights, mixing our already brightened turquoise color with even more bone white. And after fixing my camera settings, because I realized they were completely fucked the whole time I was recording. The next step was to dry brush the entire model with Arid Earth by Army Painter. Dry brushing is the only reason any of my armies have ever been fully painted, ever. If you're not familiar, dry brushing is taking a ton of paint on your brush and gradually wiping all the paint off until it feels like you've wasted the vast majority of it. But you haven't. What you've actually done is created the perfect little paint duster that'll naturally and easily pick out all the raised edges of your model, creating an effect that makes it look like you did more work than you actually did. It's insane how much low dry brushing adds to a model, especially one as highly detailed and complicated as this Ork Meka Dread. I think it took me around 5, maybe 5.5 hours to finish this model in total. If I highlighted this whole thing instead of dry brushing, that would have easily been at least like 7, maybe 8 hours instead. Sometimes people put pressure on themselves to edge highlight when they probably should be dry brushing it because they feel like it's the more professional, craft-honed way to paint or whatever. But in reality, dry brushing often looks better. Unless you're painting a manageable amount of models or you're just really goddamn patient, use dry brushing, it could save your life. I'm mostly somebody who thinks about painting in terms of entire armies though. If you're someone who paints 4 or 5 models a year, this might not apply to you as much, but if you're somebody who wants a fully painted army in a reasonable amount of time, dry brushing can be really helpful. You really don't want to use that much paint here. Less is more. A lot of people, my former self included, tend to not wipe that much paint off because you're afraid of wasting it. It's this weird visceral thing where you don't want to wipe quite as much paint off as you probably should, but really, you're not wasting it. It'll look better the less you use. Just be super light and do multiple coats if you have to. After I finished dry brushing, I went on and tried to spray some object source light highlights around the model. Some of it looked pretty good, some didn't. I tried messing around with making his eye glow and have it reflect on the face, but I wasn't really happy with it and ended up painting over it eventually, as you'll see later. Airbrushes aren't a very forgiving medium. It's hard to go back over spots to make them look natural again sometimes, so you want to be pretty careful when you add in bold color choices. It's hard to fix those gradients without just going back over them entirely and painting again. Even though I wasn't super happy with how the glowing effect looked, the orange was definitely a good call. Models look good with dynamic contrasting colors like this. It makes them more eye-catching from a distance. This model's huge, which helps it stand out, but especially for small models, you want to think in terms of big, medium, and small shapes. If you were to break something like this Space Marine down into a big, medium, and small color palette, big would obviously be the blue, medium would be the gold trim, and then red would be your small accent color. They work together to make the model really stand out. This isn't dogma. People break this all the time and make really cool looking paint schemes, but it's a helpful starting point if you're looking to create a color scheme for your army. For this model, my big color is going to be the teal. The metal color that's going to go on his joints is going to create my primary medium shape. I'm going to use Arid Earth to create a secondary medium shape on the face and his feet. And finally, I'm going to use an orange yellow, the color that stands out the most from my big shape on the eye and any of the glowing bits on the gun. I made the foolish decision to go back over the orange area and made the same mistake twice, trying a different shade of orange, which I still hated this time, but I liked how it looked on the rest of the model, so it wasn't all bad. It's kind of hard to see from here, but it's the same technique that I did for the blue, where I applied a slightly brighter shade of orange on top of my base color, and then I went back over that with an even brighter color that was mixed with some Flash Gets Yellow. And with that, it's time to do the actual chipping. I'm using a really old brush with frayed bristles, and I'm applying a lot of water to the edges of the model. When I do paint chipping, I try and focus on the edges, and any other areas where it feels like if this was a real robot walking around would be bumped into or scraped up against. The other thing I try and focus on is covering areas that are maybe too big and not broken up by any other varying colors. So like large flat areas or surfaces that are kind of boring and could use a little bit of color contrast and texture variation to make them more interesting. After I'm done chipping, I use a paper towel to go back and soak up any of the extra moisture that's still left on the model. And here's a quick shot of what he looks like at the end of this stage. Chipping really helps add a sense of scale to the model too. Having small texture details in your large surface areas helps provide some context for scale when you compare this model to the rest of your army. Adding small decals to vehicles are really great for the same purpose. For the next step, I applied a coat of light rust wash. Any bright orange enamel paint will do fine here. I used enamel paint to try and contribute to the ambient occlusion effect I was talking about before, basically just outlining the recesses of the model. And then I did the same thing slightly more discerningly with Streaking Rust, which is another ammo brand enamel paint. Enamel paints are so good for realistic weathering. There's something that are more commonly used than the historical model paint community. Because Games Workshop doesn't manufacture enamel paints, I feel like a lot of Warhammer players don't know about them. And the reason Games Workshop doesn't manufacture them is probably because they will give you Alzheimer's by the time you're 27. They smell awful, and I had 2 brain hernias over the course of making this video. If you do decide to taste the forbidden fruit, please use proper ventilation. And I would also suggest using a particle mask or face mask with a particle filter. To double down on my Alzheimer's, I'm also using odorless paint thinner to water it down. This is basically the same thing as watering down acrylic paint, but acrylic paint doesn't bond off the enamel very well. If my pitch for enamel paint wasn't enticing enough, it will also completely fuck up your brushes for life. You have to clean them with odorless paint thinner after in order to remove the pigment. I'm going to die of cancer by the time I'm 35, but goddamn does that rust look good. If you don't want to use enamel paints, you could probably water down some Troll Slayer orange or another bright orange color to create a similar effect without destroying your brain's retention capacity, at least not completely. After I was done deep frying my brain, I base coated all the metal pieces of brass scorpion. I then picked up most of the rivets with bright gold. Rivets are one of the most time-consuming and, for me at least, frustrating parts of painting a model, but they do add a lot to the finished look. Don't feel compelled to paint every rivet, just try and get the more noticeable ones. It's important to look like they're all painted from far away, but it doesn't mean they actually all have to be painted. After that, I selectively edge highlighted parts of the model with a bright silver. For a rusty vehicle like this, I feel like it actually looks a little bit better if you don't do the entirety of the model. It tends to make vehicles look too shiny if you do. Like before with the rust, try and add it to the areas that you feel like might actually be bumped into if this were a real robot, or flat areas that you feel like could benefit from some more surface texture. I painted the skull for the 3rd time using thin down layers of air to earth. I used the pretty frayed brush for a lot of this in order to use the brush's natural texture to give them a more ragged appearance to it. It makes it feel like a real orc actually painted this. I then went and dry brushed the feet, teeth, and little baby hands with White Scar by Games Workshop, just to demuddy them a little bit. Weathering tends to make all your paints look a little blended together, which is good in some ways, but it can also make your color choices look unfocused if you're not careful. Before we do our next round of weathering, I wanted to add some freehand markings with a Faber-Castell pen. These are really great for creating guides when you're doing freehand. For me, at least, it's easier to have more control over them as opposed to using a brush. You could probably use a mechanical pencil for the same purpose. After finishing drawing our guides, I went back and painted all the checkers in with a slightly watered down coat of Abaddon Black, followed by a slightly watered down coat of White Scar for the rest of the checkers. It's hard to be super precise while painting these. I tend to make little mistakes, then go back over. I think after this first pass of white, I went back and fixed some of the black ones that I thought were sloppy. We're painting orcs, so a little bit of sloppiness makes the model look better, but I still wanted to try and be moderately precise. These Copic multi-liner brush pens are really great for doing line work too. It's time to start weathering the freehand a little bit. I'm going to use a different, darker ammo enamel paint in order to make some streaks. Here's the model again after some streaking effects have been applied to the checkers. Streaking with enamel paint is really forgiving because if you make a mistake, you can just add some thinner and go back over it. Again, paint thinner will kill you though. I usually wear latex gloves whenever I'm painting with enamels, or if I'm airbrushing, but I'm trying to ration them for COVID-19 reasons, so I didn't end up using them that much today. Next, I did a second layer of streaking effect using light rust wash this time, and I used a really old, very frayed brush tip in order to use the brush's natural texture to create a more interesting pattern. I love using old brushes for this kind of thing. The frayed texture adds a lot. I also painted all of the cables on the model with Black Templar contrast paint. If you don't have contrast paint, using watered down, normal acrylic black paint works fine too. I use a lot of foam while I'm painting. The texture is really nice for doing metal chips. To start, I dipped the foam in some dry to dark and just using like a very light amount of it, tried to paint a spongy texture onto the edges of the model. Just like before, try and bear in mind areas that would be more inclined to be chipping if this was a real robot. Then after that, I did a second coat with Shining Silver by Army Painter, doing the exact same method. After that, I used some Flash Gets Yellow to pick out the eyes and like do highlights on top of all the glowing areas. And here he is after this step. I think I mixed in some Troll Slayer orange to try and blend it out and did a little bit of glaze in the corners. For any of the areas of a wider surface area, like the spheres, I water it down a lot and paint in small, thin layers. And I do a little dot at the end that's less diluted. That's a mixture of White Scar and Flash Gets. These weathering pencils produced by AK Interactive are super awesome and also will not give you cancer. They're basically just colored pencils filled with pigment that you can use to create chipping effects. After applying them to the surface of the model, if you mix a little bit of water in and go back over them, you can create cool blending and gradient gradients too. I painted the base with Vallejo orange brown. If you use texture paint to base your model, or even if you use like PVA glue and some gravel, it's important to seal it with acrylic paint later, otherwise it'll chip off over time. Especially the GW texture paints, for whatever reason, if I don't base coat them, they'll flake off. Dry brushing on top isn't enough to seal it in. I feel like you have to use something heavier if you want it to actually stop from chipping. If you like the color of your texture paint a lot and you don't want to paint over it, you could probably use matte varnish by hand or some watered down Mod Podge. This step takes a long time to dry, so while I was waiting for it, I moved on to painting the orc pilot on top, starting with a base of ogre and camo. I want to do a video entirely dedicated to painting orc skin at some point, so I'm not going to go over this part in that much detail, but basically the process was to base coat the skin with ogre and camo, do a coat of Waywatcher green glaze on top, pick out all the metal areas with brass scorpion, and then after the Waywatcher green glaze is dry, do a second coat of ogre and camo, and then a third coat of ogre and camo mixed in with a little bit of arid earth. I also used a Athonian camo shade to add some muscle definition to his arms and lower lip. The red areas were base coated with Shining Silver by Army Painter, and then I painted over that with Spirit Stone Red, which is a Games Workshop technical gem paint. And then I did a dot of Flash Gets Yellow in the center to create a little bit of a reflection. I painted the teeth with arid earth, went over the metal areas with some more enamel paint, added a little bit of Shining Silver chipping to the metal too, then painted his right eye with Evil Sun Scarlet with a dot of Troll Slayer Orange in the center, and then a dot of Flash Gets Yellow in the center of that. I painted over his force field gun thing with some watered down Troll Slayer Orange to create an object source light glowing effect. After the orange-brown was then drying, I dry brushed the base with arid earth. I went over a lot of the cracks of Agrax Earthshade too. I'd usually use enamel paints for this instead of Agrax Earthshade, but I decided my brain had had enough Alzheimer's for the day. I then immediately changed my mind on my Alzheimer's stance and decided it could take one more hit of North African Dust Effect by Ammo. I applied this to the feet and a little bit of the leg to try and give the impression that kicked up dust had gotten stuck in some of his joints. Basing can really make or break a model, and especially if you're doing an army, you want to have a base that looks good from far away. If most of your model was one big color, like my model is here, having a base that's a much different color can help it pop out a lot. If you're having a hard time deciding on a color for the base of your model, going with something that's on the opposite side of the color wheel from whatever most of your model is a good rule of thumb to follow, especially for something like this, where most of the model is one big color, and also because his base is so large and noticeable. Adobe puts out a free interactive color wheel that's great for this purpose. I used a couple different kinds of static grass in order to create the little tufts. A few of them are from a company called Warlord Games, a few are from Army Painter. I think they're called Wasteland Tufts. Then I used a few from Games Workshop as well. The plastic alien looking plant is from the Games Workshop Barbed Bracken kit. I dry brushed all the plants with a mix of Flash Gets Yellow, Orange Brown, and arid earth, and then I did some shadows using enamel paint around the base of the plant. It helps them stand out a little bit more. I did the same thing around the feet a little bit too. Painting the base rim adds a lot to the model. Models never feel finished to me until the base rim is painted. If the rim isn't a solid color, it feels distracting to me. When you're painting an army, having all your base rims be the same color helps establish a uniformity. Put on some Vallejo splash mud after this. It's basically just a really thick acrylic paint that you can use to create splashing texture. All I did was put a pretty thick glob on the tip of an old brush. Then I used my finger to flick the brush back. This process is very messy, so be careful with it. I put some Vallejo engine oil on some of the metal parts after this. I honestly don't know what it's made out of, but it does say acrylic on the front, so it's probably less likely to kill you. After 24 hours, you want to put another coat of matte varnish on top. This is to permanently seal in the paint chipping medium that we put on earlier. If you don't do this, anytime the model gets wet, the paint will reactivate and it'll start peeling again. But even if you don't use chipping medium, you want to seal in your models, especially forge-rolled ones with resin parts like this, because the paint will flake off over time. Typically, I put a coat of semi-gloss on, let that dry for 24 hours, and then put 1 or 2 coats of matte varnish on top. If you don't want to do that, you can probably get away with just doing 1 coat of matte varnish though. But if you're playing a lot of tournaments or flying around the country with them, I would definitely put at least 2 or 3 separate coats of varnish on top.
And that's it.
We did it. We painted an Ork Meka drip. Hopefully we're not on the precipice of the extinction of man. And as long as society is still here next week, I'll keep making these videos. Don't go outside. Yeah, thanks for watching. Bye.